From training to performing, join our big league conversation. Welcome to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast with your host, Eric Cressey.
Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 25. To celebrate the quarter century mark, we've got an awesome show with John O'Neill, our Director of Performance at CSP Massachusetts, joining us. We're going to dig in really deep on how to plan out your offseason, whether you're a high school, college, or professional baseball player. But before we get to it, I want to introduce you to today's sponsor. This show is brought to you by Juve Red Light Therapy. I was first introduced to Juve because we had multiple clients who'd reported some favorable experiences with red light therapy. So I started to dig deeper myself and actually started using the product with favorable results as well after viewing some really compelling research. What's interesting, there's wide-ranging and clinically proven benefits that stem from red light therapy, enhancing mitochondrial function. So it can range from faster muscle recovery to enhanced sleep to improved athletic performance to a reduction in pain and inflammation, as well as some prominent hormonal changes. There's some really interesting before-after changes in testosterone levels. So why Juve? Well, they're the leaders and true innovators when it comes to red light therapy in the industry. They have a cool modular Lego block design that allows you to build out a full body system over time. So the investment on the front end can be a lot lower and you can expand it as you desire. Its therapeutic energy output is third-party tested and validated. It's a Class 2 registered FDA device, so it's real legit technology. There's tons of different ways to use a Juve. You can put it on a door, a mobile stand, a tabletop, or against a wall. They have a product called the Juve Go, which is a portable red light therapy device that works great for putting it on specific joints because it fits in the palm of your hand and easily positioned. It's the same medical grade power as the larger Juve device. It's wireless and rechargeable. So really interesting stuff and something that I think is going to really dictate a lot of our sports science stuff in the years ahead. And I think I've already learned to appreciate it as a competitive advantage on the recovery side of things. So if you head to juve.com/Eric and use referral code Cressey, you'll receive a free gift with your purchase. Again, that's juve.com, JOOV.com/ERIC. You can use the referral code Cressey, CRESSEY, to receive a free gift with your purchase. It's awesome stuff. I'm really enjoying it, and I think you'd like to check it out as well. Today's co-host was first introduced to Cressey Sports Performance after a shoulder surgery during his college baseball career brought him in 2010. He finished out his college career at Dickinson College and graduated with a Bachelor's of Science in Mathematics in 2014 and followed it up with an internship with the Baltimore Orioles. Thereafter, he set his sights on the strength and conditioning field with internships at Ranfone Training Systems and was part of the first internship class at Cressey Sports Performance Florida in the fall of 2014. He went on to work at Drive 495 and also served as a high school baseball coach before returning to Cressey Sports Performance in 2017. He served as the Director of Sports Performance at CSP Mass for the last 2 years. Please welcome to the show, John O'Neill. All right, John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
It seems really weird to welcome you to the show when literally I see you 6 days a week.
It does. I actually was at the gym this morning and decided I might as well go home to make this feel more like a real podcast.
I know. We're a mile and a half away from one another on FaceTime audio. So it's at least that makes it authentic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we haven't had this conversation before, nor do I know the questions, so it should sound pretty good.
Absolutely. In the interest of being fully candid, I actually haven't even written out questions. I have like one big overarching question that will hopefully lead to a longer discussion. So with that said, we're August 27th as we record this. That means high school season has wrapped up for most people. College guys, we have community college guys who were back like 2 weeks ago. On a daily basis, we say goodbyes to some of our higher level guys, who are headed back to D1 programs, things like that. I know like we have a Stanford kid right here who did a summer session course and is now here and headed back in mid-September because they're on a different schedule. Minor league baseball guys are, basically wrapping up as we speak. The next week or so, we'll get a crew of those that are coming back. And then, big league guys wrap up on September 30th. So I think it's good to attack this from many different facets. And I think the best place to start is probably on the high school side of things, because we have a lot of players and coaches and parents in that regard that listen to this, and then we'll work up. So as a high school kid walks in to see you, whether it's a guy who's advanced and you've seen him in the past for years, or it's a guy who's, brand new, has never walked into Cressey Sports Performance, what are your priorities with a high school kid?
Sure. So I actually look at this in a couple ways. So one, on my end, I actually plan everything out prior to. Like, I try to predict, all right, what is the average high school kid going to look like that we're going to see this off season? Mm-hmm. And I actually have 6 months blocked out. And the percentage of high school kids who actually fit it to a T for all 6 months is very, very small.
Yep.
I would say that the first month stays pretty consistent for people. It's like, all right, we're going to get them back in. It's going to be a GPP phase. It's going to be, centered around learning how to absorb force, learning how to handle an eccentric load. From there, and then month 2, month 3, et cetera, is going to vary based on how they're doing on that month 1. But from my end, it all starts with a plan. On the other end, the way I look at assessments on a younger, or in the in the lower age groups, is more so in relationship to, all right, what's the gold standard in whatever position they're trying to play, whether they're a JV kid trying to make varsity, whether they're a varsity kid that wants to play college ball. It's just, what is their goal and how far are they off from it on a straight physical level. So the first thing is usually size. I'll explain to kids, because we'll get kids who are 170 pounds, and they'll tell us, like, oh, I'm trying to lose a little bit of weight. I'm like, well, the major league average pitcher, I think last year was 213 pounds, I think that was 2017. It was 213 pounds. I think over 70% of major league pitchers are over 200 pounds. And so if somebody's looking to throw 90 plus miles an hour, which is the obvious gold standard for everybody, mm-hmm. Or for gold standard for a high school kid at least, their goal should be to look like that person. So that's the obvious step one. Even before you get into the different table tests and the integrated movement screens that we do, when you don't have a high training age, mm-hmm. not all those measurements are incredibly valid. Just because the lower training, like if you're 14, 15, 16, with no injury history, all those table tests you can completely manipulate, through 1 corrective exercise, 2 corrective exercises, a month of training, they might look totally different. So, long-winded answer, but I think size is the biggest one. And then, how far off from skill-wise are they compared to that gold standard or whatever they're trying to do. So like the gold standard to me of a varsity high school pitcher in this area is a kid who's close to 90 miles an hour and has 2 or 3 pitches. And if you get a 15, 16-year-old, your job, I think, is to compare him to them and say, all right, what do they not have that this kid has?
Yeah.
And oftentimes in our scenario, we have usually, close to a handful of kids who are in that neighborhood of that upper 80s, maybe touching 90, low 90s high school arm. And, it's our job to say, all right, what do those kids do really, really well? A lot of times it's just consistency in the gym. They've been coming in for 2 straight years, 4 days a week for 6 months in the off season. And it's our job to take that 15-year-old and say, all right, well, this is not going to change in the next 2 weeks, but if you can commit to this off season, we can put a dent in these numbers. And we might not do it for everybody. We're going to have kids who, their ceiling is Division III ball. Their ceiling is varsity baseball. But whatever it is, we're just trying to take them towards that.
Yeah, I think, you hinted at this, is nowadays there's more information than ever before, right? You can go on Twitter or Instagram and you can get advanced strategies galore. Like you can go to 500 different places and get spend several $1,000s for a biomechanical assessment, all this stuff that in many cases is going to tell you something that's right in front of your eyes, that any, normal person who has no, even the most basic knowledge of exercise physiology could tell you. And that's that, like, you don't need a crazy advanced periodization strategy. What you need is to go in the kitchen and make yourself a sandwich and like consistently show up for a lot of training, because these don't just like magically happen out of nowhere.
Well, and so I used to phrase the question to the kids, like, have you been in a weight room before? Or, what's your experience in a weight room before? And every kid tries to fudge that number because they think, you're, like a college recruiter or a teacher or a parent. But then if you phrase, the way I phrase it now is I say, when's the last time that you were in a gym for 3 days a week for 3 months straight? Mm-hmm. And pretty much every 14, 15, 16-year-old looks at you like with a blank expression because they don't have an answer. Mm-hmm. And so to me, if you don't have an answer to that question with, from last December through February, I was in there 3 days a week for 3 months. If you don't have that answer to that question, that's the low hanging fruit in the room. It's like if you're looking for to improve your diet, you don't need to go to a nutritionist if you don't eat a vegetable, right? You just need to eat vegetables.
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of thing. So just show up, and obviously we believe in our product, but if you believe in your product as a coach, the job is just to get people to show up, and people will get better at that age.
Absolutely. I think one thing that's been helpful with that crew, and honestly with all crews, but I think it particularly lends itself well to the untrained high school population with, big aspirations of playing professional baseball someday, or, even just college baseball, is that I think an exit bullpen on video at the end of, August or whenever they wrap up can be incredibly telling, right? Because it's a chance to put something that you can see visually, a front leg collapsing, or someone who has no idea how to load their back hip. We see these physical competencies that they're lacking at high speeds. And you can break it down, and you can immediately, effectively create context with respect to, the assessment you just did. Here are the things that you struggle with, right? You folded up like a lawn chair when we asked you to go into single leg stance. Here's what your front leg does when you get into landing. Like, you don't have a bracing strategy. You're not able to get that front hip pull back. So I think an exit bullpen can be really, really helpful for a lot of those athletes to basically like reiterate the things that are glaringly obvious on an evaluation. Like, hey, if you can't do a quality push-up because your hips are on the floor and you're in forward head posture and your low back's arched, like, you're probably not going to be able to control your trunk through a high level delivery.
Yeah, totally. And I think I know you have Lee Taft coming on the podcast coming up next, but I'm stealing this line from him. Like, a good strength coach can watch the sport happen and tell you how the person is going to struggle in their assessment. And so, we've seen enough guys through our pro crowd, through the college summer program, through our high school crew who both throws and trains, to know, like, all right, we consistently see this pattern on the mound. We've done enough of these assessments to say, all right, this person isn't going to have good, right hip internal rotation, isn't going to have good overhead shoulder flexion. I bet their anterior core control is going to be pretty poor. Whatever it is, I think we have a trained enough eye at this point to tell, based on the delivery, what we're going to see in the eval. Not just the other way around, which is the standard in our profession. If we look at the table test, try to predict what's going to happen on the mound. I think when you've done enough of them, you can do it both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the high school crowd that we're kind of touching on, but I don't think you can have a discussion of what does the off-season strength and conditioning look like for these kids without first having the discussion of, all right, it's August 27th. Do I play fall ball? And in Massachusetts, right, fall ball basically can go until about October 15th, and then it gets too cold. Usually it's, one day on the weekend, maybe a practice midweek if, it's a really organized program. Whereas in Florida, it goes right up till like November 15th or 20th. Like, there's an extra, 5 weeks or so. There's no concerns about that. So I always say it's easier to develop players especially on the pitching side in Massachusetts, because the weather, basically blocks you from just, honing in on skill development year one. But for you, like, when you talk to these guys in Mass, what are the key, like, talking points with respect to deciding whether you want them to play fall baseball?
Yeah. So I think the big thing for me is, like, are you going to set yourself up for success within the fall ball season? So, when kids ask me, or if they say something about throwing, whether it's throwing bullpens with a pitching coach or playing fall ball itself, the big thing to me is, are you doing things in between those that would actually set yourself up to be any good when you do that? So, like, the analogy I'll use is, if you were a sprinter in track and field, you wouldn't just sprint on the day of your race, because you would lose every race, right? If you decided, I'm going to take 6 days off and then sprint and see how I do, it wouldn't make any sense, because you'd lose every time. And I think that's the big problem with a lot of the kids who play fall ball up here is, it's like you said, it's Sundays only. It's, by late October, it's 40 degrees on Sunday morning. They don't touch a baseball from, Sunday night up until the next Sunday morning. And so you're basically, if you're not getting better, you're getting worse, right? So you're putting yourself, in harm's way, potential risk for injury, and even outside of that, you're probably not performing your best. And if you're performing at a much diminished, version of yourself, you're not training yourself to get better in the long run. And I think that's the advantage of a place like we have, or any place that has a more integrated model of training and throwing. Is you can get kids in the door 4 days a week. You can make sure they're on top of their throwing program, so you can make sure that when they do pitch on the weekends, that they're going to be in shape to do so. But that's, what I see all throughout when people ask me about the fall ball thing, or, when if they're somewhere else and they're playing, it's like, all right, well, what are you doing in between? Because not doing anything doesn't cut it.
Yeah, and we both know that not every player right now is anywhere close. I mean, they're not homogenous. You have guys that have like absolutely no innings because they played for maybe like a summer ball team that carried too many guys in the roster and they were pitcher only, or, a two-way guy and they threw, an inning a week, things like that. And we have other guys that, are rolling in with way too many innings. So like, what are your benchmarks?
Yeah.
Like, what are your red flags?
Yeah. And to me, it's trends. So, all right. So, regardless of what the number is, and I think somewhere in the 70, 80 inning mark is probably getting to be too much for a high school kid.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly if it's 100 or more, I think there's absolutely no reason to play fall ball.
Mm-hmm.
If it's 60 or 70, it's a discussion. 70, 80 becomes that tipping point of like, all right, does this make any sense to me? And you might have different numbers. I don't have those numbers set in stone. But to me, it's more so the conversation of trends. So, when were you at your best? Was it April? Was it beginning of season? Was it July, August? Tell me a little bit about the soreness you were having. So, after an April start, were you able to throw the next day? Could you throw a bullpen or long toss 2 days later? What would happen after a July start? What would happen after an early August start? If that trend is going down, it doesn't make any sense to keep going with that trend and play fall ball. If that trend is coming up, it might make sense, and, you've thrown 50, 60 innings or less. I think it definitely makes sense to play fall ball because that means you're putting yourself in a position for success. But, every conversation is individual. I think what it comes down to is actually having a built-in relationship with the athletes where they know that you're not, trying to make them do something that wouldn't be in their best interest.
Yeah.
I think kids in general, between, whether it's everything being a test score, everything being objective, every game they play in is basically like a showcase or a tournament in front of coaches. Everything to them feels like a test.
Mm-hmm.
It's making sure that they know the conversation with you is not. Like, they don't have to pass it. They can say, I'm sore, I'm beat up. That's fine. We'll figure out the best route for you. Yeah. That's the advantage I think the private sector has over, whether it's the school sector or something else where you feel like you have to lie to your coaches. There's no reason for one of our athletes to ever have to lie to us.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think, the other thing is just, it's the big white elephant in the room is like, let's be honest, how many guys really get seen playing fall ball? Like, fall ball is great if you've been hurt and you need to go and make up some of that development. It's significantly, helpful for, kids who may need to go like late into the recruiting. Like a lot of the Ivy Leagues will still recruit into the fall if you have a guy who's a late bloomer. So there's certainly a time when kids need to go to those fall events, but they're very much in the minority. It's if you're a high school senior who hasn't figured out where you're going to play yet, like, yeah, maybe that's the time to let it eat a little bit later into the year so that you can actually get seen. But for the most part, like, what is fall ball? It's like on a terrible like field with, really windy conditions. Everybody's cold. Like, you're lucky if you have enough guys for the whole roster. In many cases, the talent is spread very, very thin. So you're maybe not throwing against the best hitters. You're maybe not facing the best pitchers. So it's not necessarily quality reps that you would often get if you're, with your travel ball team in Georgia, in the middle of July. So it's one of those things where you think you have to really weigh your opportunity costs. Like, what else could I be doing? And that's a challenge. I think the other side of it too is, and this piggybacks on some of the discussions with Ben Hansen, from a recent podcast where, it doesn't have to be either or. Sometimes it can be and, right? Sometimes kids might not play fall baseball, but they might continue to throw and work on things. And they might, do it in a, from a pitch design standpoint. They may, do more of just like playing catch to hone in on some of the mechanical changes they've made so they don't kind of lose that, feeling of motor learning. So, it doesn't have to necessarily be competitive baseball. Sometimes it can be baseball in a very, very limited capacity. And we have that conversation with, actually a fair amount of pro guys now. Like, we have guys that don't shut down, but they just keep playing catch, preserve the feel, just do enough so that the ramp up isn't so extreme. But what I think it comes back to is, what are your priorities, right? Like, you actually have to start every assessment. This is why I think we make a point of sitting down in the office with everyone in so much detail. Like, you have to do a needs analysis. And, at the start of that needs analysis, literally the first interaction that they have when they walk into CSP, beyond just a hello to the front desk person, is they do a health history. We need to know if you are broken or hurt, because whether you're high school, college, or professional athlete, like, movement competencies and symptoms trump everything else, right? If you're symptomatic, like, you shouldn't be playing baseball, right? If you're symptomatic, like, there are going to be things that are contraindicated in the weight room. And what we know is that inherently baseball, just like every other sport, brings people away from neutral, right? Most people who don't do anything usually feel pretty good. Most people who play athletics at a really, really high level have some aches and pains by the time a competitive season wraps up. In our baseball population, like, this is like the thing that nobody talks about, like in the training world, is like, you have guys that come off of a year of anti-inflammatories. You see Major League Baseball teams handing out, Medrol dose packs, September 1st, just so that everyone feels like they're walking on air for the last month and into the postseason. Even if nothing hurts, they're being proactive with it. Like, these things are handed out like candy in many cases. And what happens when those guys all come off of, the daily pill and all that stuff, is they usually hurt a lot. Like, the first 2 weeks of the off season, you see a lot of dudes like hobbling around who think they're going to go play golf, but they realize when all that stuff wears off, like, that golfing is the last thing they want to do. And instead they're in for manual therapy, mobility work, treatments, things like that.
I think there's a big misnomer that health and performance are the same thing.
Yeah.
For example, like, let's talk you and I, like, if we wanted to purely be healthy, we would never deadlift a heavy weight again.
Yeah.
Right? We enjoy it, and that's what we want to perform at, right? So the idea of getting somebody to perform is based on, are they healthy?
Yeah.
But they're not the same thing at all. So, like, early off season to me is, let's provide health now so that you can perform later. Like, throwing a baseball 95 miles an hour is not healthy.
Yeah.
But that's high level performance. Right. And so it's our job. And let's say, if we're talking pro ball, it's our job in starting September in the minor league, September, October into November, get guys as healthy as possible so that when their throwing programs ramp up, they can perform. Any high level performer in any sport is not going to be your prototype of health long term.
Yeah.
It's not just the NFL or football. It's any sport, obviously with different injuries or different tendencies. But high level baseball and performance is not long-term health. It's not the same thing.
Yeah. So early off-season priority, regardless of your level, needs to be like fixing what hurts and having a candid discussion about that. Hey, you've seen all these advanced training techniques. You don't need a crazy involved periodization strategy. You need to be consistent and work on moving better so that your symptoms go away. And in many cases, that might be a scenario where you refer out to an ortho or physical therapist or massage therapist or whoever it may be, to kind of make that the priority. And I think, we hit the high school side of things pretty hard. College is tricky, right? Like, 'cause we both know, like, what we see at this time of year. Like, we have a 10-week college program that runs from June 3rd to August 10th. So we had, 42 guys in that crew. And those guys are all going back to different places, right? Some are going to Division I programs with, huge budgets that, have optimal recovery protocols and things like that. We have other ones that are, going back to, basically Division II programs that might not even have a strength coach on staff. We have, other places where, it's a community college where the pitching coach is also the strength coach. And what I always come back to is when we send them back, the most important thing we can do is not just like give them physical changes and mechanical changes and all that. We need to give them education so that they're advocates for themselves. So they know what's worked for me well over the last 3 months. How do I carry it forward?
And I think it's the influence of our industry and social media on our industry, but there's another misnomer that health is determined by an exact exercise or biomechanics or, if you do this, you'll be healthy. Any kind of programming or any kind of health decision is too multifactorial to determine, like, all right, this is the one thing you need.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's the big thing that we get when we have kids in all summer is they're going to get, or all summer, all off season, whatever it is, we're going to have discussions with them on nutrition. We're going to have discussions with them on sleep, on their throwing programs, on their training programs, whether it's strength related, power related, speed related, mobility related. All those things are going to factor into something that is going to perform later on and something that's going to be healthy in the long run. And so I think when you get somebody in, you can't just look at it and say, all right, you're missing this range of motion. if you can get this range of motion, you'll be healthy, because we don't actually know that. We know that there's a trend. There's a trend that, full joint range of motion is going to be healthier in the long run. But it's not a do this, get this result.
No doubt about it. So when you have college guys, this is the challenge. As they head back and they tend to, you don't even call it like an off season really, because the off season for college guys is not clearly defined. It's different for everybody. And the off season might be 3 weeks in August, between when summer ball wraps up and the time you get on campus, when fall ball is expected to go. So fall ball might last 4 weeks. It might just go all the way through the spring semester, depending on the methodologies of the coaches. So what I always come back to with college guys is the one thing that is universal is, even if your schedule changes dramatically, you have to move well. Whether you are going to play straight through, whether you're going to have ramp up, shut down, all those, you have to figure out the movement side of things and how you move uniquely. But I also think for the college guys is so important from an off-season planning standpoint is you need to have those candid conversations with your coaches to know when you're expected to be full go baseball ready, and kind of find the lows to offset the highs in that regard. But also right now is the time to figure out what you're doing over winter break, because that's a crucial time period. I can't tell you how many times, like, we have guys that come in, December 10th, the second their fall semester ends, where they want to be like, we got to figure this out. Like, my mechanics are off, or I'm hurting, or something like that, because what always seems to surprise guys is how quick that ramp up is from January to February, where they're playing games so much sooner than really professional players are. It kind of does surprise them. So, like, right now, if you're a college guy listening to this, like, now is the time to figure out, like, what you're doing over winter break. Like, are you putting yourself in the best position possible? Because if you go home and you just take 3 weeks off from throwing and, don't follow a consistent strength program, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, and I think it goes, we always talk about this more so with our pro crowd, because I think it's a more common trend. In the pro crowd, don't take 3-4 weeks totally off at the end of the season.
Yes.
And it is the exact same thing in college, except in college, a lot of times nobody's watching you if you do that. So nobody's going to be like, oh, how come you did this, right?
Yeah.
Or where's that guy been? And so, it's one thing to just roll out of bed and show up in the weight room and do what you're told. It's another thing to actually take care of your body.
Yeah.
Those are different. Those are two totally separate things. So I think if you're in college right now, let's say your fall ball season ends mid-October, late October, you have to know before that season ends, what does my November look like? Mm-hmm. What does my December look like? What does my January look like? Because your February is going to be set for you. Your February, whether it's, most schools, even at Division III level, are starting games by the end of that month. So that month is set for you, but a lot of times November, December, January, you have to set yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, it's like health and performance is not a 4 hour a week thing. So, just rolling out of bed and saying, all right, I'll show up to all these, these 4, 6 a.m. lifts that I have to go to. And that's checking the box for me in terms of being ready for baseball season. If you want to perform at the highest level, that's not enough. That's okay if you want to be middle of the pack. And so, for those guys, whether it's a conversation with people like us, conversation with their pitching coaches, their head coaches, they have to know, all right, what's my throwing plan? What's my throwing progression? What do I need to work on? What is something that I was lacking in fall ball? What is something I was lacking last season? What am I doing to kind of separate myself from the pack of people who you have to assume that a lot of people are going to be the roll out of bed, show up and check the box. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So, you hinted at some stuff. So, like, we're going to roll to the professional side of things, and I'm going to take the lead on this because this is something I'm absurdly passionate about. Like, Back in 2009, I wrote an article and put out basically this, my opinion that the single biggest mistake that professional baseball players make is just taking 3 to 4 weeks off at the end of the season. And this is something that back then was literally like the recommendation to, I bet 90% of players. Like, you would get a minor league strength coordinator that said, guys, just like, hey, just take these off, like, go hiking, do yoga for the next month. They'd throw like these very like broad stroke recommendations, on the assumption that all these guys were like, basically just physically exhausted and they needed time to mentally recharge and all that. And the game is so much different now, literally 10 years later. What I come back to is look at, these guys, right? So, if I wrote that in 2009, think about it this way. Corey Kluber was in 2009, in Double-A. if Corey Kluber just took a month off at the end of each season, instead of coming back in like that first week, like he always does, he's missed a year of development since then. That's a lifetime in baseball context, particularly in a sport where, 80+% of guys don't make it to the big leagues. And we've seen like it can be life changing to come in and train for 10 weeks in a summer as a college kid and, gain 6 to 8 miles an hour and learn a new pitch and all these things. So I think the problem is that, there's an assumption on the part of a lot of strength and conditioning professionals and skill development coaches in professional sports that all of these guys are idiots, right? That they're going to go and start back squatting 600 like the first week back, that they're going to literally beat themselves into the ground. And my feeling has always been, I want to see you right after the season for 2 reasons. The first reason is whenever possible, I want to get like an exit bullpen, like out of our pitchers so that I can actually see where they are when they're maybe at their most fine-tuned, when they've had the most skill work in to really show them at their best. So we can actually, put them on Rapsodo. We can put them on the high-speed cameras. We can get a lot of the information that we need because it's going to allow us to acquire a lot of, stuff that's going to help us plan later on. So that's the first thing. And second, I think that video stuff allows us to really work well side by side with what we do from a physical evaluation standpoint. But more importantly is there's 2 things. The first thing is you're going to identify big red flags, right? So some of those guys are going to walk in with, basically a 20-degree elbow flexion contracture. That's not bony. That's really just soft tissue in nature. And if somebody walks in on September 5th with that after a long minor league season, I'm like, all right, this is low-hanging fruit, right? We can get some manual therapy, get 1 treatment a week and do some daily stretching. We can get all this motion back before we're getting close, because what winds up happening when you take that month off, throwing sneaks up on you, whether you're taking time off or not, and guys as a general, I guess baseball wide trend, they're taking less time off. In the past it was, start up on Thanksgiving and then Thanksgiving became November 1st. And sometimes you had guys that threw 30 innings in the minor leagues and wanted to start October 1st. It's just crept up over the years, and throwing should never sneak up on you physically. You should never be questioning when you start to throw as a pro baseball player in the offseason. You should literally be fired up, gung-ho, ready to kick the door to the gym down on your first day of throwing. And when you take so much time off on the front end, you don't pick that low-hanging fruit that's really easy to get, right? The aerobic base, the mobility changes, some of the low-level core control stuff, the body weight changes. So that's the first side of things. The other thing is the actual reality of it. Minor league baseball lifestyle is not good, right? There's lots of late nights. There's long bus rides. There's unhealthy food. There's alcohol. There's erratic training. There's underwhelming gym access. There's just nothing that's particularly good about it from a long-term health standpoint. And what I can tell you that's challenging is when you get into that mindset, it's hard to get out of it if you're not someone who's been through it before and has trained yourself to do so. We have a lot of athletes that will not eat well until they start training, right? They will not go to bed on time until they start training. They'll still continue to make choices. And, you see a lot of guys, basically finish up the season and then they meet up with their college buddies and they booze and play golf or whatever it is. And it's one thing if they do it for a couple of days. It's another thing altogether when that becomes a month. And that happens a lot. More so than probably the casual fan recognizes. So I'm a big believer in getting those guys back in quickly, because immediately it allows us to flip that switch to actually living like what we would consider a healthy lifestyle, whether you're a baseball player or you're an accountant. Have you seen the same thing?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. The big ones for me are, restoring joint range of motion is very easy if you make it a priority.
Yes.
It's very difficult if you're fighting uphill. And so if you decide, this overhead shoulder flexion deficit that I have, we're gonna start hitting in January. It's gonna be an uphill battle. If you decide we're gonna hit that in September when you're not throwing, when training is relatively low in terms of intensity, but maybe high in volume in terms of just getting into the gym frequently, then it could be very, very easy to change.
Yep.
The other thing I think is size changes. And so, we know, our guys know, all right, this is when I felt my best. And oftentimes, at least at the minor league and younger level, it's, guys lose weight throughout the season. It's a really easy opportunity to put weight back on. Yep. You're eating at home. You're actually able to sit down and cook meals, food shop, Those are probably the 2 big things for me. And, I think the the other thing you hit on going back is, 10 years ago when people were told to go hiking and do yoga, the concept of doing what you haven't been doing in a while is right. The methods were wrong. Mm-hmm. And so the concept of, all right, let's do predominantly aerobic work. Let's get used to handling eccentric stress, which we weren't trying to put on you during the season. Mm-hmm. Let's get back to doing, just kind of low level force production, slow strength for lack of a better term. That's stuff that on a force velocity curve you were not doing all season, or you weren't doing much of all season. So now's the opportunity to do so. And so the concepts of doing what you weren't doing were right. The methods were wrong. Or we can do them better if we actually get people in. So, just summarizing, it's joint range of motion, it's size, and it's force production to me are the big things that you can get ahead of. Just because when you start throwing or when you're throwing bullpens, that becomes a priority. Your skill is always going to be the priority. And if you're, trying to worry about, I want to put some size on, or I want to, increase max strength or whatever deficits you may have on a force velocity curve, it's probably too late when your skill stuff becomes a priority.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing too is like some things take time, right? There are
Yep.
qualities that come around quickly. You mentioned joint range of motion. Like, yeah, you can do some dry needling and improve shoulder flexion by 30 degrees in a matter of 20 seconds. Whether
Yep.
you hold it all after the session is another thing. But like, there's one example. Like we had an athlete last year, and I'll let you tell the story, but he was an interesting case. He's got a history of like ulnar nerve symptoms, really like gritty necks, almost like a pseudothoracic outlet type presentation. And what was interesting about him was he came back was he was bilateral like knee pain, and it had been going on for like a good chunk of the year. Tell the story.
Yeah. So, in terms of an assessment, if you were to, at the end of our assessments, we usually write down a bunch of things. We circle or star what's potentially off that allows us to kind of zone in on those things. It was one of those assessments where you circle or star every single thing. You're like, all right, this is not normal. This is off. And so in my head, that becomes, all right, this isn't a biomechanical issue. Biomechanics don't all of a sudden have everything go wrong at the same time. And so, just talking to him about, sleep habits was good. Not a guy who, who drinks a lot. Not a guy who quote, doesn't take care of his body. Had him look into food allergies just as like, all right, this is kind of if you look at a dartboard, this is the one we haven't hit. Let's see what happens. And within a month or so of cutting out gluten and dairy, knee pain was gone. Achilles tendon pain was gone. He had bilateral Achilles tendon pain, which I thought was a red flag considering he hadn't really been running or, doing anything explosive all season outside of pitching, anything explosive from a lower leg compartment standpoint. And so that's a strange presentation from a pitcher to have bilateral Achilles tendon soreness just from throwing. And so that became the kind of the low-hanging fruit. And I think that guides to, it's an athlete that, I've known my entire time at CSP. You've known for longer. Yeah. And it's someone who, buys into the idea that, this being healthy is not a issue of like, what mobility drill do I need? Being healthy is an idea of like, all right, what is affecting the way my body moves? How can I change that? And, we've had other athletes that we try to change sleep habits, other athletes that totally revamp what they do on the skill end of it. And, for him, it was a nutrition thing, but, he's been healthy all season in, playing AA baseball right now. And, I believe he's still gluten and dairy free. He was for the whole off season, but his knee pain and his Achilles pain never came back.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think it just speaks to like pick the low hanging fruit. Like that's the biggest reminder that we can give folks going into this is have a really like legitimate, kind of conversation with someone who can critically evaluate those needs and be emotionally undetached, right? If you have someone that's trying to sell you, sell you an aggressive throwing program, of course they're going to push you to start throwing early, something along those lines. So I think that's a good segue into like, what does a typical off season look like for most of our pro guys? So I'll lay some stuff out like right now. Sure. And I think it's also good for us to talk about maybe how we've changed some of this stuff, over the last couple of years. So, what I typically love to see is, we'll see a guy who, comes in, does his like exit, like bullpen evaluation, all that. And literally then take your week. Like if you need a week to move, gather your thoughts, like, take care of what you need to take care of, all that stuff. I think, that week and a half is probably a good amount of downtime for most guys. And that's because there's so much time built in over the course of the off season where you're going to get those breaks, right? There's going to be, maybe a vacation. Somebody's going to get married. You're going to go to a bachelor party. There's going to be a break between Christmas and New Year's. Like the move to spring training, you always lose a couple of days. So I never like to almost like put in too much planned time off because it always seems to take care of itself. That said, that week on the front end is a good bet. And where, I think we have maybe made our mark in the industry and differentiated ourselves a lot is that first month of training. The last thing guys want to do is get really aggressive with rotation. The last thing they want to do is push like a lot of sprinting, things like that when they've been running gassers and running the bases and being on their feet a ton. That first month for us is very much about get back in the weight room, pick the low hanging fruit from a strength standpoint, start building volume over the course of a couple weeks, literally add 5 to 10% in some of the loads from week to week, change your body, get your body composition right while you eat better and get better sleep and things like that. And what we'll also do in that month is we'll do a fair amount of easy stuff, meaning like balance training, working on static balances. We've got some predictive capabilities with respect to baseball performance, and it's easy to work on. So it's not aggressive med ball throwing, but it's kind of some anti-rotation stuff. It's some single leg stuff. We'll also work in an aerobic component that month. And the reason we do so is you need to have a robust aerobic component. Because it allows you to bounce back between pitches, between games, between training sessions, between sets. And I think people lose sight of that because they, like we talked about in the distance running podcast, is like they hate distance running so much, but they shouldn't hate the potential favorable benefits that you could get from it if it was actually done correctly. So you want, to optimize mitochondrial function and capillary density and all those things. So that first month for us is a chance to hone in on some of that stuff and help to build that foundation of work capacity that's going to set us up for a really successful off season. So, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, the big thing to me is the variable you can't change in anything is time.
Yeah.
Right. And so, when your time isn't dedicated towards skill development, which in September, October, November, it usually isn't, you might as well have it dedicated towards, health and long-term performance development. And so, come January, February, if that's your window to get in shape, well, you're getting in shape from a strength standpoint, a speed standpoint, a mobility standpoint, and a skill standpoint all at the same time, versus being ready to get in shape from a skill standpoint because you've already done everything else. So, like our sessions in October, November, into December are inherently longer than our sessions in February, and they should be. From just a straight time is the variable you can't change standpoint. I think the other thing you hit on, I mean, I know you covered it a lot in the distance running podcast, but just getting in the gym 6 days a week for, whether it's 45 minutes on a movement day to an hour and a half on a lifting day. A majority of those sessions are inherently aerobic.
Yeah.
Just because we're not crushing people with glycolytic finishers. We're not, making a movement day built around the idea of getting tired. Just by being in there 6 days a week, you're inherently training the aerobic system. And a lot of times you don't have the ability to do that in season. And if you do, it's these 15, 20, 30-minute sessions, potentially only a couple days a week. And the lifestyle, at least of minor league baseball, is hurting your body's ability to adapt from those sessions anyway. And so it's the first, September is the first time to really work on that. And it's not necessarily like what exercises are you doing that make it aerobic. It's what exercises are you not doing, or what kind of training are you not doing, from a work rest ratio and and a fatigue standpoint that make the session aerobic.
Absolutely. So, and that's setting the stage for actually going out and getting a little more aggressive. And I'd say where we've changed that first month is, we know that power is probably the aspect of training that is the quickest to detrain. And that's challenging because you have to reconcile these guys have been standing around in cleats for an extended period of time. They're banged up in the month of September as minor league guys. Like, we can't just throw them into really aggressive movement training progressions where they're sprinting 3 to 4 days a week. They're doing box jumps and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So we've, I think over the years maybe overcorrected that and done almost none and just done aerobic based stuff. And what I found, and I'm sure you can agree, is that the ramp up time on the amount of movement training and sprint stuff that we wanted to do in that subsequent month, it took too long. When you take that between the 1 week off and then the 4 weeks to actually ramp up. 5 weeks without sprinting for a lot of these guys is a really big deal, and you're losing out a lot of adaptations. What's your take on the best way to attack that first month from a movement training standpoint?
Yeah, and so I think the one thing that I'm excited about for this year that I think we're doing better than ever is this concept of all season you're basically unloading. For lack of a better term, it's just force expression left and right. So you're never actually working on the ability to load, you're accelerating. You're never really working on the ability to decelerate. And so we're gonna do, and we did a lot of it with our college guys. I think it went really well. We're going to do a lot of, just working on basic loading progressions. And so, for jump training, it doesn't have to be jump as high as you can, jump as far as you can, jump as fast as you can. Jump training can be as simple as work on the initial loading phase of a jump.
Yeah.
That's how we're going to, keep that quality trained. And that's how we're going to set people up for success in, months 2, 3, and 4 of the off season. And so I think our ability to teach, the handling eccentric stress and, absorbing force and whatever terms you want to use. I think the easiest one to use is just loading. The ability to teach loading in that first month, I think, is really, really important.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So, we build on that topic by, really for me, a minor league guy, really around like October 15th, that's go time.
Yep.
That's a crucial time period because we're going to start training med ball stuff very, very hard, usually a rotational and an overhead, exercise 3 days a week. Basically that, it's a substantial amount of volume. We're going to start really getting into our sprint progressions, and it's a faster ramp up where we do have guys running at 100%, in that second month because we have done at least a little bit of foundational work that allows for it. So we are actually getting to a point where we can train speed, in that early stage because like we talked about, power is a quality that detrains really quickly, whereas, strength and aerobic based stuff will stick around for a long time. So, we're actually getting into a loading period. And, it's really funny because like every time I do an Instagram Q&A, people are like, you use a conjugate setup with your athletes? Like, how do you reconcile the fact that everybody thinks that, Westside only works because people are, on drugs or using powerlifting equipment, all this stuff? I'm like, you realize that there are conjugate programs that aren't Westside barbell driven, right?
Yeah.
Like conjugate just means that you're training a lot of qualities at the same time and that you're prioritizing certain ones at different points in the year. So that first month, it's improving basically aerobic capacity and tissue resilience and to some degree muscular endurance just by adding so much volume. And then in month 2, there's an intensification point where you de-emphasize some of those previous qualities and start to hit strength and power substantially harder.
Yeah. And so, a couple things, just thoughts I had based on what you just said. Going back to what I said before, like this idea of teaching loading and actually having a concentrated block where you teach loading. Good sport coaches, whether it's a baseball coach or any other sport, have talked about the concept of energy leakage or loss of ability to transfer up the kinetic chain for a long, long time. That's not a new concept. And so let's take a rotational med ball throw, which you mentioned we're probably going to start ramping up around month 2 of the off season or sometime in October. If you can't actually, do the eccentric portion of the med ball throw correctly or well, you're setting yourself up for failure when you go into the concentric portion. So when you go to actually throw the med ball, if you can't load into your back hip and load your torso and load your trunk, you're not gonna throw that ball, throw the ball as hard as you can. And that's the first thing for me is like, all right, the loading phase in terms of getting somebody's body ready to jump and sprint and do all this stuff, it's going to have a direct carryover to me towards skill development, whether it's a rotational med ball throw or eventually swinging a bat or throwing a baseball. The other thing is I think a lot of people are scared to sprint people, just because they don't necessarily program it correctly from a volume standpoint, from a work rest ratio standpoint, and I think people I think they confuse the sprinting for fitness and sprinting for performance are very, very different things. And, I think one thing that we do a much better job of than we used to is actually making sure we're taking adequate rest between sprints, making sure that, volumes are appropriate, whether it's removing, lifting volume on the back end of the session, whether it's, conversation actually we had yesterday about, the day after sprinting, maybe cutting back on jumping, whatever it is, and making sure that things that happen at really high velocities, are, stand out in your programming and aren't just blended in.
Yeah.
Aren't just blended in as like, oh, let's just do that. Or let's just throw that in at the end.
Yeah.
It's okay to throw in a core exercise or a mobility exercise. It's not okay to throw in something at high speed. That has to be, a priority in terms of your programming. In terms of initial sprint progressions, we talked about this idea of having, soft starts or rolling starts. So, it's not, get in a 3-point stance and sprint as hard as you can as your first sprint progression, right? And so we do a lot of, whether it's, a jog in start where it's just a light jog into a sprint, whether it's a build up, whether it's something like a shuffle into a sprint, stuff like that. So you're not going from 0 to 100.
Yeah.
You're going from, 50 to 100.
Yeah.
I think that's your initial baseline progression. Obviously, when you get towards the season, you have to be able to explode 0 to 100. But the ability to go from 50 to 100 takes precedent.
Yeah. If you look at, and I wonder if a lot of people have read this just because the book's been out so long, and I think it's maybe been unfairly maybe de-emphasized over the years as people have gotten so caught up in maybe more cutting edge topics. But if you read like Vladimir Satsky-Orsky's Science of Practice of Strength Training, he talks a lot about this concept of delayed transmutation.
Yep.
So with this principle is like you build this general motor qualities, right? You spend the off season getting stronger, getting faster, throwing the med ball, things like that. And ultimately, there's a time that has to take before all of those general principles carry over to hitting a baseball, throwing a baseball, all those. And if you haven't done the right things in the first 2 months, it pushes everything else back. It takes substantial amount of time. And obviously there's, all kinds of discussions with respect to skill acquisition and specificity and all those things that we can have on future podcasts. But, I think people forget that you just can't jump into the most specific aspect of things after a period of time off. Like you have to build, there's a stepwise progression, and there have to be foundational qualities that are in place for you to have the smoothest, transmutation possible when the time comes. So,
well, it goes back to anything. Like it's this assumption that like, all right, I lifted heavy for a few months, so I should obviously be really strong.
Yes.
I ran some sprints, so I obviously got faster. I did a throwing program, so I obviously throw harder.
Yeah.
Things that it's never a what did you do? It's how did you do it? And so the example that I always give kids, especially, is it's not check the box on that set. It's the quality of that set, right? Or it's, on our end, it's where you put that set in relation to training. When you expect that set to actually, bear fruition and actually translate to the mound or to the box or whatever it is. And so like the example I'll use is like, all right, I'll ask kids like, is chicken good for you? And every kid will look at me and say like, yeah, chicken's good for you. I'm like, all right. So if you did a set that I would compare to McDonald's chicken nuggets, would that be good for you? All right. And so there's things that are incredibly variable, and the quality of what you do. We're just running sprints to get faster doesn't make you faster. Running sprints with high quality makes you faster. This is tangential, but it made me think of it. I'm actually always surprised when, whether it's another coach or, and it's somebody who's been around for a little while hasn't read that book, because of all the old like Russian texts, Science Practice is like one of the easiest to read.
Yep.
But that's just a note for any strength coach listening to it.
Absolutely. So, and then we'll kind of blow through a little bit more of the strength addition aspect of it, because I think it's important to get to the skill development component. So, basically October 15th through November 15th is, accumulating volume on rotational training with med ball stuff. Basically November 15th into December 15th is a continuation of it, right? It's an intensification strategy.
Yep.
Maybe not quite as much, maybe volume stays the same, but the intensification is more pronounced. Sprint volume tends to go up. And then really what you're starting to do once December 15th rolls around in an ideal minor league model is you're starting to scale back a little bit. Where, if you have guys that are really strong, they may go to 3 days a week lifting instead of 4. But you're starting to pull back a little bit, because that's when the skill acquisition stuff really starts to take, priority, meaning, look at a lot of those, minor league guys who say start throwing November 1st or November 15th. They're 4 to 6 weeks into their throwing programs. A lot of guys start hitting November 1st as well. And that's when things are ramping up. The volume of actual skill work is really starting to take priority. And the last thing you want to do is just keep adding. So you have to start pulling away if all of a sudden those guys are
throwing at 300 feet on their long toss. They're starting to mix in, sometimes bullpens. There's usually weighted ball stuff. So there's a substantially higher skill specific component that starts to come around once December rolls around, at least in our model.
Yep.
And then we're talking minor league guys. So we'll talk big league guys afterwards into January, when there's going to be more of a pullback on, really the volume of strength and power training in the weight room, because more and more of that is happening in a skill context. Guys might start taking more live BPs and things along those lines. The intensity is substantially higher. That leads into, mid-February, when guys are often reporting, some guys will be around until, the first week in March, where we effectively kind of have to run spring training. So there's a transition of, basically general motor potential into skill specific activity over the course of the offseason. I don't think people get that. I think that's something that's markedly misunderstood in the baseball world, is that there's no give and take. It's continue to add, continue to add, continue to add. And I think that's a place where we've had to differentiate ourselves. With that said, the hard part is when you get a big leaguer, and we'll throw out like Corey Kluber, right? 249 innings pitched in 2016. I think the World Series Game 7 was November 1st. That's a really short off season when you basically have November, December, January, and then I think it was actually an early report date in 2017 as well. So you immediately lose that month of an off season. So he has 2 months less than our minor league guys really do. That's time crunch. So you have to effectively ask yourself, like, what are the qualities that I'm willing to pull back on? So, with certain athletes, they preserve their aerobic base really well. So maybe we can not extend that base quite as long. Maybe we start getting them back into the weight room, a little bit sooner. Really, where I think the biggest, sacrifice is, instead of having like really 2 months to train that med ball stuff really hard, you probably have a month where, the throwing has to probably start for a guy like him by December 20th at the latest, if he finishes up at the end of October. So you're just working with a shorter off season. But where you get into trouble is if you have that guy that wants to take a month after the World Series. You are in big trouble if you are a Major League Baseball player that doesn't do anything until mid to late December. It's a terrible, terrible place to be. And, there's still guys that, maybe not nearly as much as they used to, but there are guys that didn't throw until they got to spring training. And I think that was one of the reasons why we saw so many guys blow out in spring training, because the intensity ramped up too fast on them. You have to put in, the work in December, January, and February to be prepared to show up when they're going to expect you to go bullpen day off, live BP and then be in a game really, really quickly. And I think that's something that, has gotten better. Teams aren't doing that quicker ramp up in February. But historically, the bigger challenge was that players weren't prepared for it.
Well, I think, one thing you kind of touched upon in there in terms of, maybe potentially shortening the med ball or the power work. I'm stealing terms from Ty Terrell here, but To me, every offseason has a phase of tissue prep, a phase of force, and a phase of power. And, if you have 6 months, you can spend 2 months on tissue prep, and maybe tissue prep is aerobic qualities. Maybe tissue prep is joint range of motion. Maybe tissue prep is just accepting an eccentric load. But if you only have 3 months, your tissue prep phase is going to be shortened by a lot. Your force phase would be the next phase. So actually getting, gross strength numbers up, the ability to repeat close to your growth strength numbers and just build this big base to later express power. Within the power work, your power work is going to be ahead of your skill work. It has to be. So like the velocity, like the first fast rotational thing you do shouldn't be swinging a bat or throwing a baseball. It should be something med ball or jump related.
Yep.
And so by the time you actually grab the implement that, is used in your sport, you should be working on your skill, not your ability to generate rotational power, or generate power, whatever it is. And maybe it's sprint work or on-field speed work. But to me, the power work is the thing that gets shortened in a short off season.
Yep.
And if you shorten the power work too much, you're essentially grabbing, a ball or a bat or whatever it is, the implement used in your sport at a time when you might not be ready to go as fast as you should be able to. And in which case you're setting yourself up for failure in terms of, potential risk for injury or operating at a much higher efficiency cost than you should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when we look at actual, I think hitting progressions are ones that, to be honest, are more defined. Like,
Yep.
guess, anecdote, like just guys understand how not to go too crazy. Guys will, hit 2 to 3 days a week and then they'll gradually ramp up. And obviously nowadays we see more guys implementing, random practice instead of block practice and, hitting live earlier in the off season and doing all these things I think are great, approaches, and some of the really progressive guys in baseball are utilizing them more and more. Pitching is much less clearly defined. I think the challenges that we see guys who, don't create the right physical foundation before they start a throwing program. So in many cases, they're in a tricky spot. Maybe they ramp up too fast. Maybe they're, not a good candidate. So like I always joke, like the perfect recipe for getting hurt with weighted balls is a quick ramp up in a hypermobile arm that doesn't have any strength. Because we know that player is going to acquire extra rotation so fast. And all of a sudden we're just magnifying the load because the implement's heavier. So, those are the guys that need to be a little bit more careful. So kind of like our general template for most guys actually is pretty consistent across the board in month one. It's play catch with a 5-ounce baseball for the first couple weeks, building out to 90 feet. And, it's mundane, it's boring, but you're gradually building up work capacity by throwing on consecutive days. And really in weeks 3 and 4, we'll start to integrate some low key, basically weighted ball stuff, really more so pre-throwing with, some reverse throws, maybe some pivot pickoffs for guys if they're a good candidate for it. And that's a great time to instruct on those because I think a lot of athletes do them incorrectly. And then really I always look at getting through the first 4 weeks as getting into the clear, right? Like that's where guys are out to, 150, maybe 180 feet after 4 weeks. And that like you've dusted off the cobwebs. It's kind of like when you turn the furnace on for the first time in the winter and it makes all those weird sounds and you're like, all right, is the house going to burn down or not? And, guys can usually tell you by 4 weeks if they're feeling good, ready to go. And then weeks 5 through 8 is a block. And then weeks, really 9 through 12, those are really critical times for pro pitchers. Whether they're minor league or big leagues, that's where you build your work capacity with more volume. It's where, intensity is ramped up. It's where the variability, in terms of long toss, weighted balls, different implements, all that stuff, comes about. And, for a lot of those guys, usually like the first pen's going to be around week 9 or 10. So I always like try to work backwards from guys' spring training report date. And in an ideal world, I always want to have like 14 weeks to work with, because it gives me wiggle room. It gives me 3-4 week phases plus 2 weeks of wild card. Maybe that's wild card. They're going on vacation and they're just going to play catch on the beach while they're on a cruise. Maybe it's the kind of thing where they're going to have a baby or have a wedding or something like that where we might miss some time. It's helpful if, we're worried that maybe something is banged up and isn't going to respond well to ramp up. So we need to, maybe have like more of like a lateralization with our throwing program. But 14 weeks is something I think is big. And what was interesting is after we ran the Ben Hansen podcast, I actually got a text from Pete Mackey. Pete's the minor league pitching coordinator for the Twins. He's like, did I hear right when Ben said he thinks it takes like 120 days to do a ramp up from a rest period? And I'm like, I went back and I listened to him like, yeah, he did say that. And I look back, I'm like, all right, what's, basically 14 times 7, it's 108. So I'm like it's 98.
98. Yep.
Yeah. Sorry. You're the math major. So when I look at that, I'm like, man, we were pretty close because Ben was talking about being ready for in-game activity. So we're at 98 days. Presumably I send a minor league guy back after a 14-week throwing program, and 22 days is about what it's going to take in many cases before they're in an opening day game. So it's just an interesting insight. And I think there are times developmentally where we can get more than that 14, and that's clutch, right? When you have that guy that starts November 1st, you get all of November, all of December, all of January, that's 95 days, give or take, when all is said and done. And then you've got 2 weeks in February where you're literally getting that 16 weeks, 17 weeks. Those are the guys that can make big jumps because you can work in strategic deloads and things like that. So, if you're a minor league player listening to this, like, and you're 88 to 90 and you were a 38th rounder and you're 5'10", 200 pounds, you're kind of a dime a dozen, like, you might be a candidate for extending your throwing program and being more aggressive this off season so that you can, still have a job next year.
You touched upon, we've touched upon it a lot in terms of guys taking time off and if you take a month off a year after, close to a decade or, in your 12 years in, you've missed a year, or just the cumulative volume of taking time off. I think the thing that I consistently see with new minor leaguers, in, the few years of working with them is they don't realize how small these margins are.
Yes.
It's like, yes, they coddled you and they babied you your first year in pro ball. But when you go back, you're one of, 50 guys in the organization who's just like you. And so, and when you go to, you go to spring training and you're throughout the season, you're on the same throwing program as the rest of them. So unless you're doing something that's separating you in November, December, January into February before spring training, you're probably going to be right in the mix the whole time. And so I think I see our guys that are the most successful and they're, they're on top of the little things from the second the off season starts. And it's not necessarily throwing the whole off season. It's just knowing when you're going to throw, knowing what you're going to work on when you throw, knowing how your body should feel before you start throwing. And so there's this huge window of opportunity, regardless if you take time off or not. And, we've certainly, I think, changed our viewpoint on that a little bit in terms of having guys take as little as 6 weeks off, 6 weeks off in some instances. But, you have to know, what competitive advantage you're trying to get because, even 2 miles an hour in today's day and age is the difference between a level and pro ball. It's the difference in playing and not.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we kind of bring all this stuff together, we've talked about it across multiple levels and I think gone in a different direction to talk about not just like the early onboarding of the off season, but also like the progression of it, like start looking, 4 to 6 months in advance for, hey, what are we trying to achieve during the month of January? Like what for you, well, let's go back and forth and I'll give you the first one. And that's that, a plan is incredibly important. But at the end of the day, a bad plan executed with 100% intensity in a good training environment is far more important than an amazing plan executed in a terrible environment with the wrong kind of attitude and everything like that. So, the message for that is if you're in the middle of nowhere and you have no resources at your fingertips, it doesn't matter how good your plan is because you're not going to be putting yourself in the best position possible. So like put yourself in a position from an environment standpoint to be really successful. Now, go ahead.
If we had the perfect program, right, we would just replicate that over and over again and we would never learn another thing and everyone would be on that program. So everything we're doing is based on a prediction model of what we've done before and say, all right, this is correlated with people who've had success and this seems to make sense and we're going to continue to do stuff like this and maybe we'll remove some of this. But this concept of I need the perfect plan, is never gonna work out because chances are the people who wrote that perfect plan are gonna have a better version of the perfect plan the next year. So my point being, like, if you need a good plan that is well coached, that is well executed, and that, has other variables taken care of. So other variables of sleep, nutrition, lifestyle stressors, etc. In order for, it to play out. I see, we obviously do distance-based programming and, I think a good plan for a lot of these distance-based kids is better than, what they would have gotten somewhere else. I think you and I both strongly believe that. But we both know that people who come into the gym all the time and get coaching on everything and are motivated by the people around them and are motivated by the environment are going to have more success in the long run. And I know you mentioned Westside before and, a lot of people have done Westside programs and never come anywhere near as close to as strong as those guys. Yeah. And it's the same concept. I mean, and maybe it's not, heavy metal and heavy deadlifts every day or whatever it is. And maybe it's just you're around guys who are talking pitching and they're talking and you learn a new cutter grip from a guy who spent time in the big leagues and all right, that changes your career because you're in every day. But those things aren't necessarily planned.
All right. So I put out my one-liner. What's your next important one-liner for anybody? Any big rock advice that you're going to throw out to high school, college, or pro baseball players that you think are markedly misunderstood with respect to attacking your off season?
Sure. Know your plan before it happens. So know kind of what you want to do going into it. Don't wait until you look at your plan and say, all right, like, I think that makes sense. I'll go with it. Like, be confident enough in it where this is, and talk to people and know, like, all right, this is what I want to do. That would be my one-liner.
Yeah. So the other one that I would actually throw out there is be very, very careful about taking skill development solutions to what are actually physical limitations or sports medicine problems. Meaning, if your shoulder is killing you, it's probably not the right place to go to an aggressive weighted ball program, right? It's probably, a scenario where we have athletes out there who continuously cut their change up or spike it or something like that because they're physically unable to get into the positions they need to be successful with it. So that's why I always come back to is movement efficiency always comes first. And so that's a really kind of huge thing to keep in mind. You got any other ones?
I think, and this is stealing a line from you, and the other one-liner, having, another minute to think about it, make sure that what you're doing is correlating with what you want to do. And so working hard is nice, but working hard doesn't separate you. Working hard while you're working smart separates you, or while you're working intelligently separates you. And so I see a lot of guys, obviously we love the weight room. That's why we got into this, and it's turned into something else. But I've seen a lot of guys get kind of married to this idea of I need this movement or this movement or this movement to go up, or to hit a certain weight, or to do a certain exercise, or to improve a certain range of motion because they were told it by somebody, and they actually have no idea if it correlates with performance on the mound or not. Don't get married to something that isn't necessarily correlated with what you want to do long run. And what you want to do long run for most of the people we're talking to is throw harder for a longer period of time. Yeah,
absolutely. I put something out on my social media not too long ago that I think relates to maybe my next suggestion here is that we've reiterated it here, is that high school, college, and pro guys are markedly different in the amount of stress placed on them, their yearly calendars, their timelines. It's really, really a bad idea if you're a high school guy on this call to basically ask what does Corey Kluber do? What does Max Scherzer do? Because you're skeletally immature. Like, there are parts of their programs that won't work for you. They've also built a really robust foundation of work capacity to get to this point. Their calendars are markedly different, but you see high school kids that compare themselves to, Lance Lynn came back incredibly fast from his Tommy John several years ago, like where I think he was actually in games before the 10-month mark. You would never dream of expecting a 17-year-old kid to do that. And there are, baseball decisions and all those factors that related to that. And obviously Lance had really high level care on a daily basis, being the guy that he was. So I think that's a really important message for this, is like, don't think that because you're a high school player, you need to do what big leaguers do. Like, their calendar may be different for you, and they may have acquired a lot of like competencies on the physical side that you don't necessarily have just yet. What you probably should be asking, and this is kind of like if you read the book Range, which came out, which was an awesome book.
I actually just got that.
David Epstein was a really, really good book. And he talked about the important questions to ask is, what did these athletes do when they were young? Like, don't ask me what my professional athlete does now. Like, ask what he did when he was a 15-year-old, to get in this position. And the answer may be like play multiple sports. The answer may be get in the weight room. The answer may be, hey, start, taking care of your mobility at a young age instead of waiting for something to go wrong. So,
and there's a number, and that could be a whole other podcast, I'm sure. But I think there are probably a lot of people who harp on this idea if you need to play another sport, it's bad to have one sport athletes, but the reality is we're not changing that. So no matter what we say, okay, the people who decide to play one sport aren't signing up to their kid up for basketball because they heard us say it on a podcast. And so we're going to have this massive number of one sport athletes, and I think it's honestly going to continue to grow. The concept is, all right, what are you doing that gets that person in your door and keeps them healthy and performing well in the long run? And so, I know for us, like our high school kids, the one sport athletes, I purposely give a lot of change of direction stuff and more explosive and elastic work that they might be getting from soccer and basketball and stuff like that. They're getting that in the gym. And so I think as a strength coach or people in our industry, it's kind of a pet peeve of mine at this point when people are like, oh, I hate how we have one sport athletes. It's like, well, what are you doing about it? That as someone in the private sector, that should mean you have the person for 9 months a year. Instead of, 4 or 6 or whatever it is. So I think the big thing is don't just get, married to this idea of like, here's a complaint that I'm going to I'm going to, hang my hat on. It's like, all right, change it, change something about that scenario.
Well, something interesting too is like, we know we have research now that shows that random practice blows block practice out of the water from a long-term skill acquisition standpoint, right? Be exposed to a wide variety of patterns and eventually good things are going to happen. There's no better random practice than playing another sport, right? Like if you're a baseball player that goes and plays soccer and you make 2,200 changes of directions over the course of a typical game, none of those are exactly the same, right? There's a bunch of different skills that are actually harnessed there. So I think we have to be really, really careful about taking advice from people who exclusively work with higher level pro athletes who are already there and applying those principles we're at a point now, like we've been in business since 2007. I've been training baseball players in Boston since 2006. Like we have middle schoolers who are throwing 100 in professional baseball now, like who started with us when they hadn't even hit puberty, who are now big leaguers. Like we have this like lifespan where we've actually looked at like how this changes, how to keep guys healthy over the extended period of time like that. So I think it's very important to like make sure that you're targeting the recommendations to the population in question.
Well, and I think this is more on the high school end too, and you could say this for the pro end, although I think there are professional scenarios where maybe you do go all in and you do say, all right, this might not be the healthiest thing for me, but performance right now might win out. When you're 14, 15, 16, 17, making that choice is always the wrong one. So saying like, all right, here's a super aggressive training and weighted ball program that might not be the healthiest thing, but there's a chance I throw 5 miles an hour harder at the end. That's always the wrong choice at that age. And there might be a place for it in pro ball, but I see a lot of, it's like the 6-minute abs fad or the 4 weeks to the perfect body nutrition plan or whatever it is. A majority of those fail after the time is over. And I think it's the same thing in training.
Absolutely. All right. So we've gone well over an hour. We're going to start to wrap things up. Folks can find more information about John on both Instagram and Twitter. He's at O'Neil Strength. That's ONEIL Strength. And then if you're interested in learning more or getting some individualized assessment, both in a longer term format or even a short term consult at one of the CSP facilities, you can email cspmass@gmail.com if you're interested in Massachusetts, or cspflorida@gmail.com if you're interested in Florida. John, thanks so much for taking the time. I will see you in 45 minutes when we start our day.
I'll see you in a little bit.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a review to read on iTunes. We welcome your suggestions for future guests and questions. Just email elitebaseballpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for your continued support, and we'll see you next episode.